Do you think Islam is compatible with the West? Not in any self-evident manner. So, although I would also say that Islam is part of the West, we should actually give that some consideration. That doesn't mean that Muslims aren't compatible with Western society. Many Muslims are no more radical Muslims than Christians are radical Christians. In fact, many Muslims aren't any more Muslims than many Christians are Christians.
Hello there, welcome to Rational Religion, where we make sense of spirituality. In today's episode of Believe You Me, we're going to be discussing Jordan Peterson's views on Islam, where he goes wrong and what he can do about it.
Hi, my name is Tahir Nasser. I'm a junior doctor working in the UK.
And my name's Umar Nasser. I'm also a junior doctor in the UK. That was exciting, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Very diverse here.
Yeah.
So we're Muslims from the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, a reformist community within the Muslim world who are trying to show what the true original teachings of Islam are.
So I think we all know who Jordan Peterson is. He's a psychology professor from Canada.
Yeah.
And he's become quite a phenomenon on YouTube and on other streaming sites in particular, and generally in terms of the literature side of things as well. He's written some really well-received books as well.
Mm-hmm.
And in terms of TV interviews, he did a TV interview which is probably going to go down in history as one of the biggest car crashes for Channel 4 ever. So, got to hand it to him. He's got some talent for a number of things. He's done well in a few things. But he has also expressed some views with respect to Islam, which, well, they're wrong. To put it bluntly, but he's acknowledged that he doesn't know much about Islam, and that it would require years of study, and he's not the kind of person who likes to make glib comments or throwaway comments, which require in-depth study.
So he gives his impressions, but before that he does say, look, I don't know much about this, but here's my impression. He wants to have these discussions with Muslims, and we want to have a bit of a remote discussion, showing you a few of his clips and talking through them. And if you're not Mr. Jordan Peterson watching this, which is probably quite likely, statistically.
No, I think he follows our website and everything.
Please send it to him.
I think he watches everything.
Because we want him to receive this information, and we want him to analyse it and critique it and do his own research off the back of it. And it's obviously quite important that he sees this, because he's a very influential voice in the West. A lot of, especially young people, follow him, and the views that people have on Islam really do colour our culture and our politics.
Yeah.
So it's not a small issue. So please do send this to him if you're not him. If you are him, please continue watching. Hi, Mr. Peterson.
Hi there.
All right, let's go.
Okay.
First clip.
Problem number 2 for me, and again, this may be a consequence of my ignorance, which I'm trying to rectify. Muhammad was a warlord. And I don't know what to do about that fact. Like, one thing you can say about Christ, hypothetically, let's say, I'm not talking about a historical reality necessarily, although I'm not denying it either, is that of all the things he was, Warlord was definitely not one of them. And I don't know what to do about that. And so I don't know how to reconcile that.
Okay, so Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is a warlord apparently. What do you make of that?
Well, I think it's an emotionally charged and fundamentally inaccurate description of him. And he mentions in his video that, he doesn't think anybody could take exception to the use of that word because he was a warlord.
Right.
But, would you say, for example, that Churchill was a warlord?
That's a bad example. He was a bit nuts.
You could say Churchill was a warlord because he was the first to use chemical weapons. Putting that aside, in the context of World War II, would you, for example, say that Churchill's actions in World War II defending Britain against reasonable or other Western leaders, would you say that is against Nazi expansion? Would you say that was the actions of warlords?
No.
You wouldn't. Warlord is a term you use only for those who are aggressors in war, and those who use battles and war as a means to expand their territories and their aims. Now, that is therefore an inaccurate portrayal of the Prophet Muhammad completely.
Why is that inaccurate?
So it's inaccurate because he didn't ever use war to spread his teachings. In fact, the greatest number of conversions after 18 years of persecution, after 6 years of having been involved in battles. He had a 2-year lull in fighting against the Meccans, and we're going to go through that all in a bit more detail, but this is a short answer to your question. He had a 2-year lull after what was known as the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. And, his number of his followers went from 3,000 men. That's the numbers we can count from the number in the army who was there. So 3,000 at the Battle of Khandak, and the Battle of the Ditch. to within 2 years, 10,000. So in other words, it took 18 years to get to 3,000 men in his community. And it took another 2 years to get to 10,000.
And
during
peacetime.
those 2 years were in the peacetime.
Right.
I mean, and when you look at the modern day world of Islam, you look at the most populous Muslim country in the world. What is it? It's in Indonesia. Indonesia was never invaded by a Muslim army. It was a group of Sufi travelers and Sufi mystics who went and they preached to the Indonesian people, who were Buddhist and Hindu at the time, and a variety of Aboriginal religions there. And they accepted Islam. And now that is the most populous country of Muslims in the world. So the idea that Islam was spread by the sword, it's an absolutely false picture of Islam.
And I think it's there because I think certain critics in the West don't want to portray Islam as a spiritually attractive teaching.
No.
So they want to say the reason why it expanded and why so many people converted was because, it was just war and it was expansion. Of course, this is intuitively ridiculous to imagine that one lone person who, is rejected by his own community is in the position to start expanding.
Yeah. How do we begin? We begin with his birth, I guess. So tell me a little bit about that.
So he was born in the 6th century in 570 of the Common Era, or AD. And at that time, Mecca, which was the chief Arab state, because they had the holy temple, I guess you'd call it there, where all the pilgrims from around Mecca travelled to and did their pilgrimage. That was where he was.
That's the Kaaba.
That's the Kaaba.
The black stone which Muslims do the circumambulation.
And at the time, they had one idol for every day of the year in there. So he was born in this society of idolatry. He grew up there. I mean, he had a very, in a sense, traumatic childhood, I guess you could say. His father died before he was born. His mother died, reports say, basically around 6 years old, when he was 6 years old. Then he went under the care of his grandfather. His grandfather died a few years later.
When he was 12.
Yeah, and then he went under the care of his uncle.
Yeah, so this is an orphan in the most extreme sense of the word. And though he was a descendant, he was a member of the most rich and wealthiest tribe in Arabia. He was, one among their number, and he had no parents. He was one of the poorest in that tribe. And this is in a society which is highly tribal. You can't conceive of how tribal this society was. It was extreme tribalism. And, he grew up to the age of about 25 as part of this tribe. And what happened then?
Well, I mean, he grew up in that society. He was known as a Sadiqul Amin, which means the most trustworthy and the most honest person. So he was renowned in his society as being their best.
So literally, this was his nickname.
Yeah.
Was the truthful or the trustworthy,
and the faithful, the
trustworthy. So I mean, this is quite an extraordinary individual right from the get go. I mean, not everybody gets. Yeah. That's not an Arab practice to just name people by those terms anyway.
No, absolutely.
But he was so exemplary in his character that they saw that this man is of these qualities.
And probably the most significant person to notice this was his future wife. So he went under the employership. I guess he was in employment by Hazrat Khadija, who was to be his wife. She was 40 years old, and when he was 25. And he traded well, and he was very, very honest in his dealings. And because of that, she, a very successful and older businesswoman, proposed to him.
So this is a woman who'd been twice widowed before, already had children, proposing, and wealthy, proposing to a poor orphan employee 15 years her junior, who accepts her marriage proposal. She pays for the wedding, right? And they live together for 25 years.
Yeah, so...
in a monogamous relationship in a society where polygamy was the norm.
Right.
Wow, that's not the picture we know.
Absolutely.
Or have been taught from the media about the Prophet Muhammad, is it?
No, because it shows when he was at his youngest. People say, he's polygamous later on in life. And he was for various reasons. I mean, he, especially largely so he could teach the women of different communities the teachings of Islam.
Yeah.
And most of the women he married were divorced, widowed. So, but when he was at his youngest, when, passions are at their highest, he wasn't like that. He married
the passions!
He married writing like a 19th century writer there.
Yeah.
And his passions were at his highest.
When passions were at their peak, he eschewed all such things and lived a life of virtue.
That's true. That's pretty much it.
That's pretty much
Minus
it.
The weird voice.
So, this is a man who then reached the age of 40, and after 50, between the age of 25 to 40, he was a man who would retreat to the cave of Hira for weeks at a time, taking provisions which his wife would pack for him, meditating, praying in this cave, for 15 years, seeking guidance for his people.
Yeah.
And
because they were, if you read accounts of his people, they were in the lowest form of civilization. They would have wars for 100 years on literally one person kicking a camel.
That actually happened.
That's a real thing.
That's one of the actual wars that happened. They used to bury.
It was a big kick. To be fair,
they used to bury their
pretty rude.
They used to bury their infant daughters alive. this is a society that used to enslave people pretty much willy-nilly if they didn't have any tribal support, and keep them enslaved for generations. It was pretty much the worst society you could imagine.
And obviously him growing up in that, he felt so spiritually,
well, you would.
at distance from that.
But because he was acutely a spiritual individual and connected to God, he felt like the world needed guidance, and he recognized that the whole world was in this state. Now, key point is, was he a warlord? He's appointed as a prophet at age 40 years old.
Yeah.
Right? Let's say he's sincere. Maybe you think he's deluded, fine. But let's say at least he's sincere, right? So he claims to be a prophet of God, and he's appointed as a prophet of God. What does he do?
So he basically goes around preaching his message to those around him. First his close family, and then his close friends and family, and then he widens his sphere, preaching his message.
So he eventually ends up preaching to the whole of Mecca. They boycott him. The boycott extends even to an economic boycott, which results in a famine against his tribe, which results in the death of his wife of 25 years, the death of his uncle who raised him after the death of his grandfather. It's known as the Year of Sorrow, right? And, this is a man who, after how many years of this kind of treatment? 10 years of this kind of treatment, okay? Where his followers are persecuted to the extreme extent that the first martyr of Islam was a woman, for example, who was stabbed with a spear through her private parts. Other people had horses tied to each hand and run in different directions to tear them physically.
They were tortured, these people, his followers.
These were literally people who were tortured. And, the best way to understand that is the fact that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be on him, he actually sent his followers on 2 waves of migrations to Abyssinia, which was a Christian kingdom. And he said, among the Christian king, you will receive your rights that are being denied to you here. And so there were 2 waves of migrations to Abyssinia to escape the persecution. Yeah. Right? While he stayed in Mecca with a very small and diminished number of followers. And then, what happened after those 10 years?
So in the 13th year, so we talked about the boycott and the deaths that ensued from that. In the 13th year...
in the 13th year, that's right.
He had an assassination attempt on his life. Another one, but this was a particularly grave one where all the other tribes teamed up on him.
They appointed one person from each tribe to stab him at the same time so that his tribe couldn't fight all of them simultaneously.
Yeah, so that's the degree of consternation that he was causing in their society, and their how strong they were in trying to.
And what was he preaching, which annoyed them so much? God is one, and all humans are equal under the sight of God. Yeah, that was his message, in effect.
So he then basically he survived that assassination attempt. We believe he was informed by God, and he survived it. Then he left, immediately that night. So then he migrated 200 miles north to Medina, which was another city where there were many of his followers. Not that many, but there were some of his followers there. So he went across the entire desert being pursued by assassins. And he had very many close calls with them.
They had a bounty on his head of 100 camels to bring him back dead or alive. So the picture we're painting for you is basically a man who was persecuted for 13 years, sent his followers on 2 sets of migrations, refused, and we didn't mention this, he refused to allow his followers to fight back against his oppressors, even though they wished for him to do so. Right? We can put those references down below. And then he himself was forced to migrate because of an assassination attempt away from the city of his birth, in which he's been living for. How old was he now? He's 53 now. He's 53 years old. At this age, after 53 years of living in the city, he's having to leave.
His wife died, his uncles died.
His wife has died, his uncles died. And he's leaving with a bounty on his head. So he goes to Medina, and what happens then?
So in Medina, it doesn't stop. So the people that were trying to kill him there then start telling the people in Medina, unless you give him up, this is a quote, they said, we'll come to you with our armies, we'll kill your men, and we'll essentially, enslave your women. So this was the statement. One of the other sort of chief of the Jews in Medina was given this ultimatum. He came to the Muslims very, very worried, but eventually they kind of reached an agreement that he wouldn't be given up. Yeah. And we also have, in the Holy Quran itself, where it discusses this, and it says that, you were in a state where you were weak in the land, and you were afraid that you would be snatched away. Yeah. Right? So this is recorded in the Quran, it's recorded in the history books, this is well known. This is the state that the Muslims were living in.
Well, it's obvious from the fact that he migrated. Yeah. 200 miles away. Yeah. And, where did the first battle take place? It didn't take far from Medina. The Badr is not that far. It's between Mecca and Medina. And the first battle, what happened? The first battle ensued because the Muslims were then given permission to fight back. But that was after Muhammad, peace be on him, was made the head of the state of Medina by the 2 idolatrous tribes there, and the 3 Jewish tribes there, right? They all, no, sorry, yeah, that's correct. And they all came together and said, Muhammad, peace be on you, Muhammad, you know, we're going to make you our leader, our elected leader, because we keep fighting amongst ourselves. We need an outsider to arbitrate between our different tribes.
Yeah.
So he was elected as the city-state's ruler.
And we'll talk about what he did in that capacity a little bit later.
Yeah.
But for now, we're discussing sort of, you know, what was the state in that early period. You know, again, it says in the Quran, it's also recorded in the sayings, actually, that they were so afraid that they couldn't even sleep at night, the Muslims. They were so afraid of attack.
Yeah.
Because they kept on hearing these rumours of attack coming in. And they said, you know, we wish for the day when we'll be able to sleep with only the fear of God in our hearts.
Yeah, absolutely. So what happened then? So they migrated twice to Abyssinia, 200 miles north to Medina, and now the Meccan idolaters still don't stop chasing them. They've sent letters being aggressive towards their other tribespeople in the city, saying, if you don't give him up, we're going to come and kill you. And what results is a confrontation. God gives permission to the Muslims after 13 years of persecution. And what does God say to Muslims? This is the first verse of the Quran that was revealed permitting Muslims to take up arms and to fight. Does it say, take up arms and conquer these people because they may be made Muslim or they may die at your hand? Is that what it says? No, it's not what it says. The Quran states in chapter 22, permission to fight is given to those against whom war is made, because they have been wronged, and indeed Allah has the power to help them. Those who have been driven out from their homes unjustly, only because they said, our Lord is Allah. And if Allah did not repel some men by means of others, cloisters and churches and synagogues and mosques, wherein the name of Allah is often remembered, would surely have been destroyed. And Allah will surely help him who helps him. So this is such an important verse because this is the permission, right? God says permission is given to fight. Okay. So this is the first time Muslims were permitted to take up arms in self-defense. And what does it say? Well, what's the reasoning given?
The reason is self-defense. It's very clear. Permission is given against those who have been fought.
Yes.
Right? So battle has already been initiated and they're responding to it in defense of themselves.
Yeah.
But then the permission actually gives the underlying principle as well, where it says it's not just permission to defend your own selves, but also it's defense of those who are being persecuted wherever they are and whatever faith and background they are.
Yeah.
So it says, you know, their cloisters are churches and synagogues and mosques.
Yeah.
And, you know, what do you make of the actual ordering there?
Well, it's really interesting because it doesn't put mosques first. It lists 4 places of worship. And it particularly says this is with respect to those who've been driven out of their homes. So this isn't just persecution in your home.
Yeah.
This isn't just
discrimination
in your city. It's got to the state where you can't live there.
Yeah.
All right. You have to leave. Okay. That's the condition that's being attached to being permitted to fight back.
Yeah.
And it says that if God did not permit some people to fight back against other people, then you would have the destruction of temples, churches, synagogues, and mosques. So it goes temples first, also described as cloisters. It actually just means temples.
Yeah.
And then it says churches, and then it says synagogues and mosques. And why is it that order that mosques is last and temples is first? The reason is because religions that are known by temples are the furthest away from Islam in theology. The next is closest is churches, because the Christian faith is closest after those types of religions which are in temples. And then the third faith, which is closest to Islam, is Judaism in its theology. And so that's placed next to, and list of third. And the last place given is mosques.
Yeah.
In other words, it's pointing out that the greatest priority isn't with respect to they're Muslims, they're like you, they have the same religious beliefs as you. It actually means that regardless of their faith, you should defend them because freedom of conscience is universal.
And it's a brilliant response to, you know, pure ultra pacifists, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely.
Saying that, you know, if people are not allowed to defend themselves when there's a tyrannical ruler, then you know, all truth will be destroyed. And there'll be no peace in the world.
Exactly. You know, these places in which God's name is oft commemorated, and this is another beautiful aspect of the Quran. The Quran acknowledges that in these other places of worship, in the temples, in the churches, and in the synagogues, the name of God is often remembered. So this was the verse of permission to fight. So unless you want to say that a man who fights in defense of freedom of conscience for all is a warlord, you know, it's just simply not an acceptable position to hold.
And also the numbers involved in the actual armies clearly shows the that he was not, you know, an expansionary
So in the first
monarch.
battle, how many Muslims were there?
So there are 300 sort of, you know, young and old with a few sort of camels here and there, but almost
I think they had
nothing.
2 camels and 2 horses,
Yeah.
or a few camels and 2 horses. They were men basically with pitchforks.
Mhm.
There were
The equivalent. Yeah.
There were 313 of them.
Mm.
They faced an army of 1,000 with, many hundreds of horses and camels.
The cream and crop of Mecca.
Fully equipped soldiers.
Yeah.
And guess who won? It was the 313 who beat them. And that kind of pattern of being outnumbered didn't stop. The next battle was the Battle of Uhud. It was 1,000 Muslims against 3,000 idolaters, we should say. And then what was in the Battle of the Ditch? It was 3,000 Muslims against about 10,000 Confederates of different communities. They'd come to fight the Muslims, both in front of the city and behind them, right? And then what happened? There was the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, which we've already mentioned. And during that treaty, the Muslims had a peace treaty with the Meccans, because the Meccans were sick of losing, basically. And they decided that they were going to have a period of peace. And during that 2-year period, the Muslims went from 3,000 in the number of their soldiers to 10,000. So during a period of peace, they expanded by 7,000, while after 18 years of persecution and warfare, they had only got up to 3,000 men. So what does that tell you about the nature of the Islamic teachings?
It means it's spiritually attractive, basically.
Yes.
And it's something, no one can really, people can't spend time in missionary activity if they're constantly fearing for their lives and they're involved in different battles or expeditions, right, in defending their people.
Yeah.
But actually, when people have a period of peace and they have security,
Yeah.
then they can go and actually preach, here is actually the message of Islam, that God is one and that people are equal, that Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is the messenger, and that we should follow him, and through following his teachings, we ourselves will be spiritually elevated towards God. Okay, so after this peace treaty was broken by the Meccans themselves because they didn't follow it, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, took his army, which was now 10,000 people, and he marched to Mecca, he surrounded it, took it by surprise, covered all the ports, and they were at his mercy, completely at his mercy. Now let's remember, this is a man whose wife died as a result of their boycott, whose uncle died, whose close followers have been persecuted, many of them been tortured and died. His own daughter, actually, who was pregnant at the time, was attacked and she died. She was thrown off the camel and she died. So
she miscarried and died.
Yeah.
As a result of that.
So this is the man that we're talking about. So what did he do when he had them at his mercy?
Well, if he was a warlord, what would you expect?
Well, he would have done what, for instance, Genghis Khan and so many other tyrants in history do when they have the upper hand. He would have slaughtered them. He would have burned their houses, done the whole warlord thing.
Yeah. So what did he do?
He did the opposite. He gathered their chiefs, whom he had been fighting for many years and who had taken so much from him in terms of in worldly things. And he said, what treatment do you expect of me? And they said, we hope that you will treat us like Joseph treated his brothers. And he said, well, then I forgive you all.
So not the treatment of a warlord?
No, not at all.
So
there was a general amnesty. There are a few people who'd committed, very, very specific crimes against the state who were punished, but that was literally 5 or 6. That wasn't
it was a very few.
The actual,
it was can be counted on 2 hands.
Yeah.
All of the chieftains, the general population, given a general pardon. Even the wife of the chieftain who'd eaten his uncle's liver on the battlefield was pardoned. Even the man who, Habar his name was, who killed his pregnant daughter was forgiven. So this is the degree of forgiveness he showed. And, Jordan Peterson makes a big deal about how he doesn't understand how a person who fights in a battle could be a moral role model for anybody. But you could only take that position if you're a pacifist, actually.
Yeah.
Because a pacifist is the one who thinks that fighting under any circumstances is illegitimate and immoral. But if you accept that there are conditions which you do need to take up arms, actually, you need a moral guide who has taken up arms and shows you how to do it in a legitimate and righteous fashion to be a moral guide for others. And in actual fact, to say that Jesus is the paragon of forgiveness, on the contrary, he is not the paragon of forgiveness. Because forgiveness can only truly be exercised when you have the power and the right of retribution.
Yeah.
Jesus at no point had the power and right of retribution over his enemies.
Yeah.
He was a victim throughout the whole of the crucifixion narrative. Okay? At no point through the crucifixion narrative did he ever have the right or power over his enemies. The Prophet Muhammad alone was put in that position. And therefore, you can't say that Jesus actually exercised true forgiveness. Because he never had the right or power of retribution. And in addition to that, he never actually demonstrated to the world what the moral example is of one who actually goes to war.
I mean, I'll give you one or two very small examples. We talked about the very, very big things, but there were small things which really shocked me when I read them. For instance, the Prophet Muhammad, he had so many rules of war, which were, extremely humane. You should only fight, actual armed combatants. You should not touch their women or children or their monks, for instance.
Or old people.
Old people, don't cut down their trees, don't
cut down any fruit-bearing trees, don't destroy their monasteries or places of worship.
I think also don't limit their access to water.
Don't limit their access to water.
So those were the standard ones, but there are few ones which were almost the fine print, which I've only sort of my adult life heard of, which I was just shocked. He said,
well, we've researched and read into them.
Yeah, which he said he said a Muslim should be the most gentle of someone who strikes someone. So this is the advice he gave to his soldiers who are fighting for their lives.
Yeah,
he should have said a Muslim should be the most gentle of someone who strikes them.
And
he also said
he actually went further than that.
He said, "Don't hit anybody's face."
So literally, this is a battle between men who are in 313 against an army of 1,000, then an army of 1,000 against an army of 3,000, then an army of 3,000 against an army of 10,000, and then he's telling his soldiers, "Don't strike the enemy on their face,
or too hard generally,
Don't disfigure them in the act of death."
Which means no wanton cruelty, nothing like that.
I mean, can you imagine that person being described as a warlord, who then, when he has power over his enemies, forgives them all, including the man who killed his daughter? And now, 1,400 years later, we read Ayaan Hirsi Ali and think we know about Islam. Well, he doesn't, but happy to voice upon it and call him a warlord and say, actually, I don't think anybody would disagree with the statement that he's a warlord. It bites, to be honest. It really bites because, he doesn't, unfortunately, it's in a way not his fault, in a way it is. You always have responsibility for what you say, but it's the culture and the environment in which he's learning about these things.
Absolutely, and at least he said, look, I want to have dialogue with Muslims and I want to learn more, so that's to his credit. So I think that's the first thing that we want to say. That's the first clip that we'll cover. We're going to be doing more episodes on Jordan Peterson's views on Islam. So again, if you're not Jordan Peterson, send this video to him so that he sees it.
And if you are Jordan Peterson, get in touch. Look, mate, we are happy to come on your show and chat with you. We're happy to have you on our show. We're very flexible.
No, any discussions, public or private, we'd be happy to talk about this more. But please do check out upcoming videos as well. Also, make sure you subscribe. The button should be down there.
Yeah.
Because we have lots of content on religion generally
and hit the bell.
Islam as well. Yeah, hit the bell. So until next time, peace be upon you.
Peace be on you.